I have with me today Patrick Mork, the CMO for GetJar, and also Ken Singer, the CEO of App Central. Patrick, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Chief Marketing Officer at GetJar. GetJar is the largest free app store out there, completely cross-platform, completely independent of any carrier or handset vendor. We distribute apps in about over 190 countries. We do somewhere around 2.5 to 3 million downloads a day. We've done about 1.8 billion downloads globally in the last couple of years. Privately funded by Excel. We've got about 50 people in 3 offices. So.
Great. And we also have Ken Singer, the CEO of App Central. Ken, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so we actually are formally On2Go, and today we changed our name to App Central. What we do is we provide the companies the ability to distribute enterprise applications to their employees, whether they're third-party apps, from GetJar or other marketplaces, or apps that they've created on their own. And the process hasn't been very easy to do, primarily for security purposes. If you look at OEMs, they want to make sure that their devices are locked down. So we try to provide a mechanism for IT managers to securely be able to distribute these apps in a self-service model, so you're not overburdening IT departments. You let employees be able to do this themselves.
Great. Well, I think most of us are familiar with app stores through largely consumer-based interfaces. I mean, I think we're all familiar with the App Store and Android market. But when you and it's a world where it's basically a large bazaar where certain elements are very important, like discoverability, et cetera. But I would imagine in the world of enterprise, there are certain elements that become crucial. You mentioned security as one element that's obviously very important in an enterprise context. Can we talk a little bit about that, Ken? What key elements are central when you start talking about app stores within an enterprise context?
Right. So
it's basically a large bazaar where certain elements are very important, like discoverability, et cetera. But I would imagine in the world of enterprise, there are certain elements that become crucial. You mentioned security as one element that's obviously very important in an enterprise context. Can we talk a little bit about that, Ken? What key elements are central when you start talking about app stores within an enterprise context?
Right. So an app store is probably the best way to describe this for an enterprise, though it's not complete, because a typical app store in the consumer space is really a purchasing event, right? It's e-commerce. It's a buyer of an app and a seller of an app finding each other and transacting something. Something gets paid and something gets transferred. In the enterprise, that's just the beginning of your issues. You are now the happy owner of a software license that you now need to manage versions, track the license of who has what, where's the data, what device is this on, and suddenly you have something that maybe an employee has paid $1 for that will cost about $50 in its lifespan to manage. So you have to think about, within the enterprise, a much wider problem set than just getting an app to someone's phone. And discoverability is a key issue because we used to be app developers for companies, and we get requests all the time from companies saying, hey, we've got a couple $100,000 to throw at building a PDF reader. Can you guys build it for us? And we said, have you looked? There's about a half dozen out there that you can get for free. So that is a big issue, but once they have that app in their network, they don't know who has it. They don't know what version is out there. And if they have paid for it and someone has lost their phone and now has gotten a new phone on a new platform or a new device, then you have to buy a whole new license. So there's no consistency over time of what to do with this stuff. So all of these problems, I can tell you, the IT departments of companies are just now waking up to, and we call it kind of an event horizon situation. The first problem that they come up against is distribution and discovery. And then once they get past that, it's, oh my God, I've got firmware updates. And with Apple, my enterprise cert expires every year, which means every one of my apps on every one of my devices will expire. How am I going to migrate them to the next one? So as they become more and more aware, it just becomes clear they need a solution to handle that.
I think when you talk about apps, it's hard to separate the conversation about platforms. And then I think obviously markets are tied to platforms very closely with Apple and Android. But there's a multiplication of platforms out there. There's 2 dominant ones in the consumer space. But I think in the enterprise, you start talking about Salesforce. We were talking to Salesforce earlier. And so really, there starts to become a multitude of platforms that becomes problematic if you're an app developer, for example. Who should I choose? I think, Patrick, you probably live with this because you guys support multiple platforms, and ultimately, where does this stop? I mean, are we going to just see some dominant ones, or do we see like a migration towards, obviously, browser, for example, as that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think unfortunately, for better or for worse, fragmentation is probably here to stay. We currently support 2,500 different phones across 8 different operating systems, and the reality is that this issue is going to be an issue for enterprises as well as for consumers, right? The fact of the matter is, if you're Pepsi and you have a sales team that's going out and selling product, and they have their tablets or their smartphones, most likely, they're going to have different devices. And so, of course, any company that's looking to get enterprise apps out into the field is going to deal with the issue of fragmentation, and is going to have to work with, not just handset manufacturers, but app stores that can support that. And I think sometimes the challenge for enterprise is, well, you're a Fortune 500 company and you need to distribute applications to your customers, and you go to the known consumer stores, and of course, they're much less interested in helping you for a lot of the known reasons, right? They are volume driven, like we are. They might not necessarily have all the necessary security protocols and all the things that you want in terms of verification or backups. And for a lot of times, just the incremental work for these stores is really not worth the effort. So it's a challenging aspect, but I think one of the examples that I like to talk about quite often when we talk about fragmentation and platforms is one of the most successful applications on GetJar that's been distributed is Facebook, right? Without any big surprise. But what is surprising is actually that the application, which has done about 110 million downloads in the last year and a half, is actually nothing more than a shortcut to the Facebook mobile site. It's not even a native application. Actually, Facebook doesn't have any applications on GetJar. All they have is a shortcut to their site. And if you look at the handset pool out there, you will realize that by looking at the numbers, they speak for themselves, right? Between iPhone and Android, about 110 million devices sold the last 14 months or so, right, in 2010. But if you look at the number of handsets that are mobile web enabled, you have actually 1.8 billion mobile web enabled phones. So enterprises need to look at this really seriously, because despite all the hype around the smartphone platforms, you're going to have a lot of people in your enterprise using different kind of phones.
Ken, we talked a little bit before the panel about some of your, I think, flagship customers that helped you shepherd, generation 1 from generation 1.0 to 2.0. I think you talked a little bit about Pepsi, where it's a highly complex customer, multinational, multi-business divisions.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the complexities that you have to work with large flagship customers, or anyone, to get an app on an app store or around an enterprise?
Sure. So actually, Pepsi is going to be here later today to talk in more detail. But companies like Pepsi, if you think about companies with 200,000 or more employees, and then also think about beyond the way that they view their business, it's not just their employees that they count as part of their network. They've got distributors, wholesalers, consultants, contractors that all need access to proprietary data, which is either resident in websites or you've got to create an application for that. So let me go back just a little bit here, and you talked a little bit about mobile web. You have the last 20 years of IT departments thinking about web, right? Everything is, if there's a problem with my website, I just change it, and overnight it's done, it's changed. And anyone who accesses it, it'll be updated, right? And we spent 20 years training IT departments to think this way. Now we've moved to client server again, where there's actually a thick client sitting on some piece of hardware that might be tethered or might not be tethered. You have no control over that once that's out of your network. So IT departments are now having to do some very unnatural acts. Think about how they're going to enable these devices that they don't have control over, right? So think about then your extended network. You're now putting applications on wholesalers' phones. You don't have control over those phones. You don't have even their phone number, or whether they move to a different wholesaler for a competitor. So these are the problems that these large companies need to think about with the counter trend of, I need to empower my network. I need to empower my employees to do their job. So they're walking a very tight line here between security and empowerment. So it's a tough thing. You're going to see a lot of people do great things here. You're going to see some people fail. It's going to go back and forth because we're still trying to discover what the appropriate line is. And our position, not shameless plug here, is that each company is going to have a different boundary here because each company does a different business. You're going to have some companies that really need to have security as a key component, as the driving part of their strategy. And others, it's all about empowerment and enablement. And they would rather err on the side of providing more information and losing some control over that information versus control. So you're going to see a lot of that. And our solution tries to speak to that reality that's coming out there. And so when we were designing a platform, we couldn't just design it for one company, right, and one user. So the system is both SaaS and on-prem. You know, we're not going to be fighting that religious war. I mean, other people can fight that, but however you're set up. We're also set up to be to empower VARs, because we know a lot of companies out there have trusted relationships with VARs. Case in point, healthcare. Everyone talks about technology there, but doctors trust other doctors and trust healthcare providers. So we have a partnership with the Greater New York Hospital Association, which they're a group purchasing organization for the East Coast. They do about $9 billion of procurement, anything from surgical gloves to food. They're trusted. We're not. So we've partnered with them with our technology, and they've now launched Haptique, which is the first healthcare app store for hospitals, doctors, and clinicians. And if you think about healthcare, this is where the future is, because doctors generally are not employees of hospitals. Because of liability issues, they can only be contractors. So they bring in their own devices. So hospitals have to find ways that they can equip these people who are always on site with their technology and their data, but then be able to know that they can remotely wipe the things that belong to them. They shouldn't be wiping personal data or anything like that, but at least the stuff that belongs to them. And so we've designed it all around those kinds of use cases. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's fine.